The silver ships of the Vextari darkened Earth's skies on a clear Tuesday morning. They came without warning, without demands, their massive vessels hovering over major cities like metal clouds promising storms. Humanity looked up in wonder, and fear as history changed forever. Fleet Commander Zarthul stood on the command deck of his flagship, watching the blue planet grow larger on the main viewing screen. His scaled skin shimmered under the artificial lights as he clasped his four-fingered hands behind his back. "Primitive," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the silent bridge. "Their most advanced weapons cannot even breach our secondary shields." Lieutenant Krevnar, his second-in-command, nodded in agreement. "The conquest will be swift, Commander. Our scouts report they are physically weaker than even our initial estimates suggested." Zarthul's mouth stretched in what passed for a smile among the Vextari. "Begin the demonstration. Target their military installations only. I want minimal civilian casualties at this stage." The orbital bombardment lasted exactly 12 minutes. Precisely targeted energy beams struck military bases across the planet, vaporizing defenses that humans had considered state-of-the-art. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. In Denver, Colorado, a park ranger named Joe Campbell watched the distant flashes of light with his binoculars. At 45, Joe had served in the Army before finding peace in the mountains. Now, as he witnessed the destruction in the distance, he felt the weight of those old memories pressing down on him. "They're hitting Fort Carson," he whispered to himself, lowering the binoculars with shaking hands. He turned to hike back to his cabin, knowing instinctively that the world he woke up to that morning no longer existed. 3 days later, the Vextari landed, their ground forces deployed in strategic locations across North America, establishing control zones with clinical efficiency. Humans who surrendered were processed, identified, and released under new restrictions. Those who fought were captured or killed. The aliens stood nearly 7 feet tall with slender bodies covered in scales that ranged from deep green to purple. Their eyes were large and yellow, with vertical pupils that expanded and contracted like a cat's. Most disturbing to humans who encountered them was their seemingly emotionless efficiency. They conquered not with rage or cruelty, but with the calm precision of beings who viewed the task as merely logical. 1 month after the initial invasion, Patrol Unit 27 moved through the suburbs of what was once Chicago. The unit consisted of 5 Vextari soldiers led by Officer Murtak, all armed with energy weapons that hung at their sides in holsters that seemed to blend with their body armor. "Building sweep," Murtak ordered, gesturing toward an abandoned library. Standard search pattern. The soldiers moved with practiced coordination, entering the building and spreading out among the dusty shelves and overturned chairs. Officer Lisven, the youngest of the group, paused at a section labeled Fiction Horror. "Officer," she called. "I've found something interesting." Murtak approached, his footsteps silent despite his size. "What is it?" Lisven held up a book with a dark cover showing a pale figure standing in a doorway. "Their literature. This section contains stories designed to stimulate fear responses." Murtak took the book, flipping through pages with a look of curiosity. "They create narratives specifically to frighten themselves? Fascinating but illogical." "There are hundreds of such books here," Lisven noted, gesturing to the shelves. "They seem to categorize their fears. Supernatural beings, darkness, death, unknown entities." Another soldier, Trevbor, joined them with a different book. This one describes creatures that consume fear itself. The humans believe their fear can manifest physically. Murtak made a sound that approximated laughter in his species. "Their brains are so primitive. They create monsters to explain their own neurological responses to stimuli." The soldiers gathered more books, becoming increasingly amused by what they found. They read passages aloud to each other, their version of laughter echoing through the empty library. "Listen to this," said Trevbor. "The darkness is not empty, it watches, it waits, it hungers. They assign sentience to absence of light. While the aliens were distracted with their finds, A movement caught Lisven's attention. She turned quickly, weapon raised, to see a human male standing in the doorway. He was older, perhaps 50 by human standards, with graying hair and worn clothing. "Identify yourself," she commanded. The human raised his hands slowly. "Frank Miller. I live nearby. I'm not armed." Murtaugh approached the human, still holding one of the horror novels. "You are in violation of curfew regulations, human. Why are you here?" Frank looked at the book in the alien's hand. "I see you found our ghost stories. Is that what you call them?" "We find them quite amusing," Murtaugh said. "Your species creates fictional terrors while ignoring real threats, like us." Frank's expression remained calm. "Those stories served a purpose. Humans have always used tales of fear to prepare for the unknown." Trevor stepped forward. "Your fear did not prepare you for us." "Maybe not," Frank acknowledged. "But our legends have power beyond the pages. Human fears have a way of becoming real." The Vextari soldiers looked at each other, their equivalent of smiles appearing on their faces. "Take him for processing," Murtaugh ordered, "and bring some of these books. Command will find them interesting from an anthropological perspective." As two soldiers escorted Frank from the building, Murtaugh continued examining the library. In the back corner he found a small room with children's books. The colorful illustrations showed monsters with friendly smiles, ghosts that helped lost children, and darkness filled with adventure rather than terror. "They teach their young to both fear and befriend the unknown," he observed. "Contradictory, yet somehow strategic." That evening, at the Vextari Forward Operating Base established in what was once a convention center, Commander Zarthul reviewed the day's reports. When he came to Patrol Unit 27's findings, he paused with interest. "Bring me these books," he ordered his aide, "and arrange an interview with the human they captured." 2 hours later, Frank Miller sat across from the commander in an interrogation room. Unlike the treatment humans expected from alien invaders in their films, he had been given water and had not been harmed. The Vextari saw no logic in cruelty. "Your patrol mentioned something interesting," Zarthul said, leaning forward slightly. "You said human fears have a way of becoming real. Explain." Frank looked at the alien commander carefully before responding. "Throughout human history, the things we fear most have shaped us. We don't just tell scary stories for entertainment. They're warnings, preparations. They help us survive." "Survive what?" Zarthul asked. "Imaginary creatures." "Survive the darkness," Frank replied simply. "Both literal and figurative. Our fears evolved for a reason, Commander. On this planet, fear is a tool for survival." Zarthul's vertical pupils contracted slightly. "Your species is fascinating in its irrationality. You conquered this planet because you learned to control your environment, yet you maintain these primitive emotional responses." "We never conquered Earth," Frank said quietly. "We just learned to live with its dangers. There are things on this planet older than humanity, Commander. Things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear." The Vexitari commander picked up one of the horror novels recovered from the library. "Fiction. Chemical reactions in your brain causing you to see threats where none exist." Frank smiled for the first time since his capture. "Maybe, but I've lived here all my life, and I know something you don't, Commander." "And what is that?" Zarthul asked, his tone dismissive. "On Earth, the difference between legend and reality is much thinner than you think. And now that you're here, you might want to ask yourself something." "Yes?" "What happens when creatures who've never known true fear suddenly find themselves on a planet where fear has been evolving for millions of years?" Zarthul closed the book. "Take him back to processing. His comments will be noted in the cultural assessment." As Frank was led away, the commander remained seated, looking at the pile of human horror stories on the table before him. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. For just a moment he thought one of those shadows moved independently of the others. A trick of the light, obviously. The Vextari had evolved beyond such primitive responses as fear. After all, that's what made them superior to humans in the first place, wasn't it? 3 months after the invasion, hidden deep in the Rocky Mountains, a group of humans gathered in what had once been a mining operation. Now it served as the main base for one of the largest resistance cells in North America. The cavern buzzed, with activity as people moved between workstations set up with salvaged equipment. Major Olivia Wright stood over a table covered with maps, her short brown hair tucked behind her ears. At 38, she had the focused gaze of someone who had seen combat long before aliens arrived. 4 people stood with her around the table, each watching as she traced a line across the map. The Vexitari have established a new forward base. Here, she said, tapping a spot about 40 miles from their location. They're expanding their patrol range into the mountains. Alan Garcia, a former communications engineer with glasses and a carefully trimmed beard, pointed to several marked locations. They've been setting up relay stations for their communications network. Each one extends their secure channel coverage by about 15 miles. How close are they to finding us? Asked Diane Powell, a stocky woman with arms corded with muscle from years of construction work before she became their explosives expert. Too close, Olivia replied. But they're also giving us an opportunity. Sam Turner, who had been a park ranger before the invasion, leaned forward. With his knowledge of the mountain terrain, he had become essential to their survival. You're thinking of hitting one of these relay stations? Olivia nodded. Not just hitting it. We need to study it. There's something about the Vextari we still don't understand, and Dr. Coleman thinks he's found a weakness. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Dr. Henry Coleman entered the planning area. The neurologist was in his early 60s with a wild mane of white hair that made him look like he had just received an electric shock. He carried a tablet displaying complex waveforms. I've analyzed the data from our last encounter, he said, setting the tablet on the table. The Vextari patrol showed unusual reactions to the sonic device we used. 2 weeks earlier, the Resistance had ambushed a small patrol using an experimental device that emitted high-frequency sound waves. The aliens had shown signs of disorientation, with 2 actually dropping their weapons and covering what passed for their ears. It wasn't just the volume, Dr. Coleman explained. It was the specific frequency pattern. Their neurological system appears hypersensitive to certain sound and light combinations that barely affect humans. Olivia looked thoughtful. Can we weaponize this? Better, said Coleman with the first smile anyone had seen on his face in months. We can terrify them. 30 miles away in what had once been a mountain resort, Commander Zarthul sat in his private quarters. On his desk lay several human books along with data tablets containing his research notes. Since the library encounter, he had become increasingly interested in human fear responses. A soft chime announced a visitor. Enter, he called. Lieutenant Krevnar stepped inside and saluted. Commander, the new forward base is operational. Patrol schedules have been updated as requested. Excellent, said Zarthul. Have you reviewed the cultural assessment I sent you? Yes, Commander. Krevnar's vertical pupils dilated slightly, the Vextari equivalent of showing interest. I find the human concept of horror difficult to understand. They create scenarios to trigger their own fear responses voluntarily. Zarthul picked up one of the books, a worn copy with a dark forest on the cover. It goes beyond entertainment. Their military training includes exposure to fear stimuli to build resilience. They've weaponized their own evolutionary weaknesses. An interesting adaptation for a species so physically vulnerable, Krevnar observed. Indeed. Zarthul set the book down. I want the patrol units updated on this research. Humans may attempt to use psychological tactics against us. They should be prepared. After Krevnar left, Zarthul returned to his reading. The humans' capacity for fear fascinated him. The Vextari had evolved on a world with few predators, their species rising to dominance early in their evolutionary history. Their emotional range was limited compared to humans. Efficiency and logic had been more valuable traits for survival on their homeworld. What would it feel like, he wondered, to experience fear as humans described it. The racing heart, the cold sweat, the paralysis of terror, all alien sensations to his kind. Their species had baseline caution responses, of course, but nothing approaching what humans called dread or horror. That night, at the Resistance base, Dr. Coleman unveiled his creation to the leadership team. It looked like a simple backpack with several small speakers and a light array attached. "I call it the Banshee," he said, powering up the device. A barely perceptible hum filled the room. It emits a combination of sound frequencies and light, patterns specifically calibrated to affect Vextari neurology. "How did you figure out the exact frequencies?" Alan asked, examining the device with professional curiosity. "Trial and error from our field observations, plus some educated guesses based on their physiology," Coleman replied. "We know their hearing range extends well beyond ours, and their eyes are more sensitive to certain light wavelengths." "What will it do to them?" Olivia asked. Coleman's expression turned serious. "Based on what we've observed, it should trigger their equivalent of our fight-or-flight response. But since they've never evolved complex fear reactions like humans have, the effect might be more severe. Their brains won't know how to process the signals." Sam looked skeptical. "So we're going to scare the aliens who don't feel fear?" "Not exactly," Coleman said. "We're going to overload sensory pathways they rarely use. It would be like suddenly gaining a new sense and having it bombarded with information." Diane grinned. "We're going to give them their first nightmare." The next morning, a Vextari patrol moved through a narrow valley about 20 miles from their new base. The unit consisted of 6 soldiers led by Officer Trev Bohr, the same soldier who had found the book about fear-eating creatures months earlier. "Maintain formation," he ordered as they navigated the rocky terrain. "Sensors indicate possible human activity in this area within the past 48 hours. The patrol moved efficiently, their weapons ready. The Vextari were natural hunters, their movements almost silent despite their size. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. High on the valley wall, concealed among the rocks, Sam Turner tracked the patrol through binoculars. Beside him, Diane Powell readied the Banshee device. "They're approaching the narrow section," Sam whispered into his radio. 30 seconds. Across the valley, hidden in a different position, Olivia acknowledged. "Copy. Stand by." The Vextari patrol reached the narrowest part of the valley where the walls rose sharply on both sides. Trevor paused, his instincts warning him that this was a perfect ambush point. "Scan the high ground," he ordered. Before his soldiers could comply, Diane activated the Banshee. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, one of the Vextari soldiers stopped suddenly, his head tilting in confusion. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Another soldier looked around nervously. "Something's wrong. My vision is fluctuating." Trev Bohr felt it too, a strange vibration that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his brain. The sensation was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and rapidly becoming intolerable. "Find the source," he ordered, but his voice sounded distant even to himself. The patrol began to move erratically, some soldiers turning in circles, others raising their weapons at shadows. One dropped to his knees, hands pressed against the sides of his head. From her position, Olivia watched through a scope as the normally disciplined aliens began to fall apart. "It's working," she whispered into her radio. "They're disoriented." Sam's voice came back, excitement evident despite his attempt to stay quiet. "The one in charge is still functioning. Diane's increasing the intensity." As the Banshee's output increased, the effect on the patrol became more pronounced. 2 more soldiers collapsed. Another fired his weapon at nothing, the energy blast, striking the valley wall harmlessly. Trev Bohr remained standing, fighting against the bizarre sensations flooding his system. Then, suddenly, he saw something that couldn't be there, a darkness deeper than shadow, moving against the valley wall. It had no definite shape, yet it seemed to reach for him with appendages that existed only at the corner of his vision. For the first time in his life, Trev Bohr experienced a sensation that humans would recognize instantly. Terror. Retreat. He shouted, his voice breaking. "Fall back to base!" The patrol fled in disarray, leaving behind equipment in their haste to escape. Only when they were well beyond the valley did the effects begin to subside. Hours later, in his command center, Zarthul listened to Trevbor's report with growing concern. "You say you saw something moving? Something that wasn't there?" he asked. Trevbor stood rigidly at attention, clearly struggling with the memory. "Yes, Commander. I know it was not real, but I could not distinguish reality from hallucination." Zarthul dismissed the officer, then turned to his research notes. The humans were using sound and light to affect his soldiers' neurology. Clever, but explainable. What troubled him was Trevbor's description of what he had seen. It matched, almost exactly, a creature described in one of the human horror books. 6 months into the occupation, the Resistance's psychological warfare campaign was in full swing. What had begun with the Banshee device had evolved into something far more sophisticated. The humans called it Operation Nightmare, and it spread through Vexitari-controlled territories like a virus of fear. In the Resistance headquarters, Olivia Wright stood before a wall map covered with small red and blue pins. The red pins marked Vexitari bases and outposts. The blue pins showed locations where Operation Nightmare had been deployed. Over the past 3 months, several red pins had been removed entirely. "Another outpost abandoned," she said, removing a red pin from a location near Boulder. "That's the 5th one this month." Alan Garcia looked up from his workstation where he monitored alien communications. "Their chatter is getting interesting. They're using new terms we haven't heard before, talking about shadow zones and contaminated areas." "They're afraid," Sam said simply, cleaning his rifle nearby. "They just don't know that's what they're feeling." Dr. Coleman entered the room carrying several new devices similar to the original Banshee but smaller and more refined. "The Mark IIIs are ready. Twice the effect at half the power consumption." Diane took one of the devices, examining it with approval. "Nice work, Doc. These will be much easier to plant." The Resistance had moved beyond simple ambushes. Now they placed modified Banshee devices in locations frequently patrolled by aliens, hiding them in trees, rocks, and abandoned buildings. The devices activated on proximity, creating haunted areas that Vextari soldiers increasingly refused to enter. "What about the symbols?" Olivia asked, turning to a table where various strange markings had been drawn on paper. "The patrol routes have changed to avoid them," Alan confirmed. "They're treating them like hazard warnings now." The symbols had been Sam's idea, strange, unsettling designs painted near Banshee locations. At first, they meant nothing, but as Vextari soldiers began associating them with the uncomfortable sensations caused by the devices, the symbols themselves became triggers for anxiety. "It's classical conditioning," Dr. Coleman had explained, "like Pavlov's dogs learning to salivate at the sound of a bell." Across the valley at the main Vextari command center, Commander Zarthul faced a growing crisis. Reports of equipment, abandonment, patrol failures, and even desertion, previously unheard of among his disciplined forces, landed on his desk daily. "The situation is becoming untenable," Lieutenant Krevnar reported. 3 more soldiers have requested psychological evaluation after last night's patrol. They claim to have seen moving shadows where none existed. Zarthul's frustration was evident in his rigid posture. "It's a human trick. Sound and light manipulation affecting our neural pathways." "With respect, Commander," Krevnar said cautiously, "the effects persist even after soldiers leave the affected areas. Some report sensations even in their sleep cycles." Zarthul stood and walked to the window overlooking the valley. Twilight approached, the shadows lengthening across the landscape. He would not admit it to anyone, but twice now he had woken from rest cycles with the distinct sensation of being watched. "Increase the rotation schedule," he ordered. "No soldier patrols the same area more than once per week, and I want these devices found and destroyed." After Krevnar left, Zarthul returned to his desk where a human book lay open. He had been studying it intently, a scientific text on fear responses rather than fiction. The human author described fear as an evolutionary advantage, a survival mechanism that kept ancestors alive in dangerous environments. The Vextari had no such adaptation. Their world had presented different challenges, and their evolution had favored logic, precision, and cooperation. The concept of being paralyzed by one's own nervous system was entirely foreign to them. Until now. That evening, Officer Lisven led a patrol into an area marked as contaminated on their updated maps. Her orders were to locate and destroy any human devices found. As the ranking officer who had first discovered the human fear literature, she had been specifically chosen for this mission. Maintain visual contact at all times, she instructed her 5 soldiers as they entered a wooded area. Full sensor sweeps, continuous reporting. The patrol moved forward cautiously, their weapons ready. The last team sent to this location had returned with reports of strange sounds and visual distortions. One soldier had been so affected he could no longer perform his duties. Lisven was determined not to let that happen to her team. She had studied the human psychological tactics and believed understanding them was the key to defeating them. Halt, she ordered suddenly, holding up a hand. Look there. On a tree ahead, a symbol had been painted in dark red, a circular design with jagged lines radiating outward. Similar symbols had been found near locations where patrols reported strange experiences. Scan for energy signatures, she commanded. A soldier moved forward with a handheld scanner. Reading unusual electromagnetic activity approximately 20 meters ahead. That's it, Lisven said with satisfaction. One of their devices. We'll locate and disable it. The patrol moved forward carefully. As they approached the area indicated by the scanner, Lisven felt a slight vibration at the base of her skull. She recognized it as the beginning of the effect previous patrols had reported. I feel it too, one of her soldiers said, his voice tight. It's uncomfortable. That's their intention, Lisven replied firmly. It's designed to trigger responses we don't normally experience. Focus on your training. They pressed forward, the sensation growing stronger. Colors seemed to shift at the edges of their vision. Sounds became distorted, the rustle of leaves now somehow threatening. Then one of the soldiers stopped abruptly. There's something there, he whispered, pointing toward a dense thicket. Lisven looked, but saw nothing. Continue the mission, she ordered. I see it too, another soldier said, raising his weapon. Movement just at the corner of my vision. Lisven was about to reprimand them when she saw it herself, a patch of darkness deeper than the surrounding shadows, seeming to shift and flow against the natural movement of the foliage. It's an effect of the device, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The scanner showed nothing there, yet all of them could see something. We need to find the device, she insisted, forcing herself to move forward. They found it hidden in a hollow tree, a small black box emitting no visible light or sound, yet clearly the source of their discomfort. Lisven carefully disabled it, and immediately the strange sensations began to fade. Collect it for study, she ordered, feeling a sense of triumph. They had completed their mission despite the psychological effects. It was only as they turned to leave that they noticed the symbols, dozens of them painted on trees and rocks throughout the area. They hadn't been visible before, or perhaps the patrol had been too focused on finding the device to notice them. Were these here when we arrived? One soldier asked, his voice uncertain. Lisven didn't answer. She knew they hadn't seen the symbols on their way in. Either they had somehow missed dozens of bright markings, impossible given their training, or someone had painted them while the patrol was distracted. Someone who had been watching them the entire time. Move out, she ordered, her voice steady despite the unfamiliar sensation spreading through her system. Maintain formation. The patrol returned to base successfully, the captured device secured for analysis. In her report, Lisven documented the mission as a complete success. She did not mention the growing darkness that seemed to follow them back, visible only when no one was looking directly at it. Nor did she report the dreams that came during her next rest cycle. Dreams of shadows, with yellow eyes that spoke in whispers. Such things were not relevant to the mission. They couldn't be real, In the resistance base, Sam Turner reported to Olivia. "They took the bait," he said with a grim smile. "Found exactly what we wanted them to find." "And the real devices?" Olivia asked. "Still in place, untouched. They never even realized they were surrounded by them." Diane Powell laughed softly. "The best part? We've got them jumping at shadows now. The next phase can begin." Dr. Coleman nodded thoughtfully. "The power of suggestion is taking hold. Soon they won't need our devices to see their fears. Their own minds will create them." As winter approached the Rocky Mountains, the Vextari occupation faced an unexpected crisis. Several remote outposts had been completely abandoned, their soldiers refusing to remain at night. Equipment was left behind, security protocols ignored. For a species that prided itself on discipline and logic, this behavior was unprecedented. Commander Zarthul stood before the High Command during an emergency communications session, the holographic images of his superiors flickering in the dim light of his office. "The situation is under control," he insisted, though the tension in his voice suggested otherwise. "We are dealing with an unusual form of human resistance, but we will adapt." "Your reports indicate otherwise, Commander," said High General Vorkath, his scaled face showing the Vextari version of disapproval. "Abandoned outposts, soldiers requesting psychological evaluation, patrol units refusing assignments. This suggests a fundamental breakdown in command structure." Zarthul straightened his posture. "The humans are using neurological warfare. They have developed devices that affect our sensory processing. We've captured several of these devices and are working to counteract their effects." "These are primitive humans," another commander said dismissively. "How could they possibly understand our neurology better than we do?" "They don't," Zarthul replied. "But they've discovered certain frequencies that trigger unusual responses in our nervous system." High General Vorkath leaned forward, his yellow eyes narrowing. "What kind of responses?" Zarthul hesitated. How could he explain fear to beings who had never experienced it? How could he describe the growing shadows, the whispers at the edge of hearing, the sensation of being watched by something that wasn't there? Disorientation, sensory distortions, difficulty distinguishing between real and false inputs. He said finally, "Nothing we cannot overcome with proper training." "See that you do," Vorkath said coldly. "We did not conquer this planet to lose it to primitive psychological tricks. I expect this situation resolved within 30 days, Commander. Otherwise, you will be replaced." After the communication ended, Zarthul remained motionless for several minutes. 30 days. The High Command didn't understand what was happening here. They couldn't understand. "Lieutenant," he called, and Kravnar appeared instantly at the door. "Prepare a full-scale sweep of the mountain region. Every available soldier. We will find this resistance and crush it once and for all." "Yes, Commander," Kravnar responded, though his usual confidence seemed diminished. "When do we begin?" "Immediately. I will lead the operation personally." Kravnar's surprise was evident. "Sir, is that wise? Your safety is... My soldiers need to see that their commander does not fear these human tricks." Zarthul interrupted sharply. "Prepare the divisions. We move at dawn." In the Resistance headquarters, the atmosphere was tense as Alan intercepted the Vextari communications. "They're planning something big," he reported to Olivia and the others gathered around the command table. "All available units. Full sweep of the mountains. Starting tomorrow at first light." Olivia studied the map, her expression grim. They were bound to try this eventually. They can't allow outposts to keep falling without response. "Zarthul himself is leading the operation," Alan added. "That's unusual. He normally stays at the command center." Dr. Coleman stroked his wild white hair thoughtfully. "He's trying to demonstrate confidence to his troops. If they see their commander unaffected by our tactics, it might restore their morale. Or it might give us our best opportunity yet," Olivia said, a plan already forming in her mind. "If we can make their commander experience the same fear his soldiers have been feeling, but worse, it could break them completely." "How?" Sam asked. "They'll be moving in large numbers." Our usual tactics won't work against full divisions. Diane. Powell, who had been quiet until now, tapped a location on the map. Devil's Canyon. It's a natural bottleneck. If we could lure at least part of their force there, we'd need something more powerful than the Banshee devices, Dr. Coleman cautioned. Something that would affect a larger area, with more intense effects. Can you build it? Olivia asked. Coleman hesitated, then nodded slowly. I've been working on a prototype, a scaled-up version that combines all the frequencies and patterns we found effective, but it would require enormous power, and we'd need to set up multiple broadcast points throughout the canyon. How many people would it take to set up? Olivia asked. At least 4 teams of 2 working through the night. Olivia looked at each person around the table. It's risky, but this might be our only chance to hit them hard enough to make a difference. If we can break their commander in front of his troops, we'd need a way to separate him from the main force, Sam pointed out. Leave that to me, said a voice from the doorway. Frank Miller stood there, the same man who had been captured in the library months ago. After being processed and released by the Vextari, he had eventually found his way to the Resistance. I know these mountains better than anyone, Frank continued. And I've spent enough time with the aliens to understand how they think. We can use that. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountains. The Vextari forces moved out in precise formation. Over 200 soldiers divided into search patterns designed to flush out any human resistance. Commander Zarthul, wearing enhanced armor with additional sensor equipment, led the Central Division personally. Maintain communication at all times, he ordered. Any sign of human devices, report immediately but do not approach. Specialized teams will handle them. The operation proceeded smoothly through the morning. The aliens' technology gave them advantages in the rough terrain, enhanced vision, motion sensors, heat detection. Yet by midday, they had found nothing. No humans, no devices, not even traces of recent activity. It's too quiet, Zarthul said to Krevnar as they paused at a vantage point overlooking a deep valley. The sensors show nothing yet. He didn't finish the sentence, but Krevnar understood. They both felt it, a growing sense of wrongness that their logical minds couldn't explain. Perhaps they've fled the region, Krevnar suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. No, Zarthul said firmly. They're here. They're watching us. As if in response to his words, a distant sound echoed through the mountains. A low, mournful wail unlike anything they had heard before. Several soldiers visibly flinched at the sound. What was that? Krevnar asked, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. Before Zarthul could answer, their communications officer rushed forward. Commander, we've detected movement in Sector 7. A small group of humans moving quickly. Show me, Zarthul demanded. The officer projected a holographic map showing heat signatures moving through a narrow canyon several miles away. That's Devil's Canyon, Krevnar said. A perfect place for an ambush. Which means they want us to follow them there, Zarthul reasoned. Divide the force. You take 2 divisions and continue the sweep pattern. I'll take 1 division and investigate the canyon. Sir, with respect, if you believe it's an ambush, then I will spring it and destroy it, Zarthul interrupted. The High Command wants results, Lieutenant. We will give them results. An hour later, Zarthul's division approached the entrance to Devil's Canyon. The narrow passage wound between towering cliffs, barely wide enough for 6 soldiers to walk abreast. The heat signatures had disappeared deeper into the canyon. Proceed with caution, Zarthul ordered. Full sensor sweep, continuous monitoring. The soldiers moved forward, tense and alert. Though none would admit it, many of them dreaded entering the shadowed passage between the high rock walls. 2. Many had experienced the strange sensations near human devices, the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being hunted by something they couldn't see. Halfway through the canyon, the first snow began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, driven by an increasingly strong wind that howled between the rock walls. Visibility dropped rapidly. Weather was not forecasted to change, an officer reported, confusion evident in his voice. Maintain formation. Zarthul commanded. Continue forward. What none of them realized was that high above, on both sides of the canyon, resistance members had positioned specialized equipment. Some generated localized weather patterns. Others waited with the powerful devices Dr. Coleman had created. And deeper in the canyon, hidden in caves and crevices, more humans prepared the final stage of their trap. As Zarthul led his soldiers deeper into the narrowing passage, the falling snow grew thicker, the wind stronger, until they could barely see 10 feet ahead. Then suddenly, a massive rumbling shook the canyon. "Avalanche!" someone shouted, as tons of snow and rock cascaded down both sides of the canyon, cutting off their retreat and separating Zarthul and a small group of soldiers from the main force. And, in that moment, as the snow settled and an unnatural silence fell, the resistance activated their devices. Silence fell in Devil's Canyon as the snow settled. Commander Zarthul found himself cut off from the main force with only 5 soldiers. Their communications crackled with static, the signal blocked by the canyon walls, and the strange devices hidden among the rocks. "Status report," Zarthul ordered, his voice steady despite the situation. "The avalanche has blocked our retreat, Commander," one soldier reported. "Forward path remains clear. The rest of our division is trapped on the other side." Zarthul considered their options. The logical choice was to continue forward, find an exit from the canyon, then circle back to help the main force. But something held him back, an unfamiliar sensation that humans would recognize as foreboding. "Commander?" The soldier waited for orders. Before Zarthul could respond, a low hum began to fill the canyon. So subtle at first that it seemed like the wind, it gradually increased until they could feel it vibrating in their bones. With the hum came a subtle shifting of light, shadows that moved contrary to the fading daylight, colors that appeared where none should be. "Activate countermeasures," Zarthul ordered. All soldiers had been equipped with devices designed to block the frequencies used in human psychological weapons. They activated them immediately, but the hum continued stronger than before. "It's not working," a soldier said, his voice rising in pitch. "The countermeasures aren't effective." Zarthul knew then that they had underestimated the humans. This was not the same technology they had encountered before. It was something new, something stronger. "Move forward," he commanded. "We need to locate the source and destroy it." The small group advanced deeper into the canyon, their movements becoming increasingly disjointed as the effects intensified. The shadows along the walls seemed to reach for them. The snow falling around them appeared to slow in midair, hanging, suspended before suddenly dropping. The very air felt thick, as if they were moving through liquid rather than atmosphere. High above the canyon floor, hidden in crevices and behind outcroppings, the resistance team watched. Dr. Coleman monitored the output of his devices, making subtle adjustments to maximize their effect. "Their neurological systems are responding exactly as predicted," he reported to Olivia via radio. "Heart rates elevated, stress hormones spiking." "What about the commander?" Olivia asked. She and Frank were positioned near the end of the canyon, where it opened into a small clearing surrounded by cliffs. "He's still functioning better than the others," Coleman replied, "but his readings are fluctuating. I don't think he can maintain control much longer." In the canyon, one of Zarthul's soldiers suddenly stopped walking. "What is that?" he whispered, pointing toward a dark crevice in the canyon wall. The others saw nothing at first, then a deeper blackness seemed to coalesce within the shadows. It had no definite shape, yet it conveyed a sense of mass and presence that registered on none of their instruments. "It is not real," Zarthul stated firmly. "A projection, an illusion created by the human devices." Even as he spoke, the darkness expanded, flowing like liquid shadow along the canyon floor. One soldier fired his weapon at it, the energy blast passing through harmlessly and striking the rock wall beyond. "Hold your fire," Zarthul ordered. "Conserve energy, it cannot harm us." But his words sounded hollow even to himself. Something fundamental was happening to his perception, to his understanding of reality. For a species that relied on logic and empirical evidence, the inability to trust one's own senses was profoundly disturbing. Another soldier dropped to his knees, hands pressed against the sides of his head. "Make it stop," he pleaded. A behavior so out of character for a Vextari that the others stared in shock. The shadow continued to flow around them, now joined by others emerging from different crevices. They began to take forms that resembled the creatures from human horror stories, shapes with too many limbs, faces with too many eyes, things that should not exist yet somehow seemed more real than the solid rock around them. "Continue forward," Zarthul commanded, his voice noticeably strained. "Do not look at them, they are not real." But with each step the visions became more vivid, more convincing. The air filled with whispers in a language none of them understood, yet somehow conveyed concepts their minds were never designed to process. Ancient fears from a planet that had shaped humanity through millions of years of evolution. In a small cave overlooking the canyon, Sam Turner watched through binoculars as the aliens struggled forward. "They're breaking," he reported to Dr. Coleman. "Two are completely non-functional now. The commander is still moving, but his movements are erratic." Coleman nodded, making a final adjustment to his control panel. Initiating final phase. The resistance had saved their most potent weapon for last. Throughout the canyon, hidden speakers began to emit a complex pattern of sounds. Some audible, others beyond human hearing but perfectly calibrated to affect Vextari neurology. Simultaneously, concealed projectors activated, casting precise light patterns designed to interact with the aliens' visual processing centers. The combined effect was overwhelming. Of the 3 soldiers still functioning, 2 collapsed immediately, their nervous systems unable to process the conflicting inputs. Only Zarthul remained standing, through sheer force of will. He staggered forward alone now, fighting against sensations his species had no words to describe. The shadows closed in around him, taking more defined shapes, enormous figures with glowing eyes reaching appendages that seemed to pass through his armor to touch his very being. "Not real," he gasped, though he no longer believed it. After what seemed like hours but was in fact only minutes, Zarthul reached the end of the canyon. It opened into a small clearing where the last light of day still illuminated the snow-covered ground. Relief flooded through him as the shadows seemed to recede, unable to follow into the light. Then he saw them, 2 humans standing calmly in the clearing. One was a woman with short brown hair and a determined expression. The other was a man he recognized. "You," Zarthul said, his voice barely functioning. "From the library." Frank Miller nodded. "I told you, Commander. On Earth, our fears have a way of becoming real." Zarthul raised his weapon with a trembling hand. "Your tricks, your devices, they cannot stop us." "We don't need to stop all of you," Olivia said quietly. "Just you." She raised her hand, and at that signal, Coleman activated the final sequence. The clearing erupted with sound and light, but not random patterns this time. Instead, the input was precisely calibrated to trigger a specific response in Vextari neurophysiology, a total shutdown of higher brain functions while leaving autonomic systems intact. Zarthul froze in place, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. His eyes remained open, pupils fully dilated, but he no longer saw the humans before him. Instead, he saw what lurked behind them, the accumulated fears of a species that had evolved on a predator-filled planet, given form and substance through his own mind. For the first time in his military career, the commander experienced complete, paralyzing terror. From the canyon came the sounds of panicked aliens, the discipline of the Vextari forces shattered at the sight of their unflappable leader reduced to a trembling, unresponsive figure. 3 days later, in the Resistance headquarters, Olivia Wright addressed her team and the representatives from other Resistance cells who had traveled to hear the news. "The Vextari forces are in full retreat from the mountain regions," she announced. "Their high command has designated Earth as a psychologically toxic environment and is considering a complete withdrawal from the planet." Cheers erupted from the gathered humans. "How did you know it would work?" someone asked when the celebration quieted. Dr. Coleman stepped forward. "We didn't, not with certainty, but we understood something the Vextari couldn't. Fear is not a weakness. It's an adaptation, a survival mechanism. Their species never developed it because they never needed it. Our species survived because of it. In a secure facility 50 miles away, Frank Miller sat across from the still catatonic Commander Zarthul. The alien's eyes remained open, fixed, on horrors only he could see. "I tried to warn you," Frank said softly. "Earth is different from other worlds you've conquered. Here the darkness has teeth. Here the monsters are real because we made them real. Not with technology, but with millions of years of evolution, with stories passed down through generations, with the collective weight of human imagination." Mayer stood and prepared to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the once mighty commander. "You came to our world and mocked our fears," Frank said. "But you never understood that those fears were our strength. They taught us to survive in the dark. They prepared us for creatures like you." As Frank closed the door behind him, he couldn't be certain, but he thought he heard the alien whisper a single word: shadow. In the weeks that followed, Vextari ships began leaving Earth's orbit. Their high command had determined that the planet's unique psychological environment made it unsuitable for conquest. The cost was too high, the risk to their forces too great. The Resistance had discovered a truth more powerful than any weapon. On a world shaped by predators and darkness, fear itself had become humanity's greatest ally. The very thing the aliens had mocked had become the force that drove them away. Earth would remember the invasion, and humanity would continue to tell stories of the shadows, the darkness,